Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Columbus of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. 3 martinis coming up.
5 days. 5 days till Election Day. I don't know if we're going to know who won 5 days from now. We might. We'll find out. But we're getting close. We're getting very close. And we've got good, bad, and... No, we don't even have bad. We have good and 2 crazy martinis for you today. All of it brought to you by Stamps.com. And Jim, the good news should be good news for everyone. This is economic news coming in on new data from the third quarter. CNBC, coming off the worst quarter in history, the U.S. economy grew at its fastest pace ever in the third quarter as a nation battered by an unprecedented pandemic started to put itself back together, the Commerce Department reported Thursday. Third quarter gross domestic product, a measure of the total goods and services produced in the July to September period, expanded at a 33.1% annualized pace, according to the department's initial estimate for the period. The gain came after a 31.4% plunge in the second quarter and was better than the 32% estimate from economists surveyed by Dow Jones. The previous post-World War II record was the 16.7% burst in the first quarter of 1950, so more than 70 years ago. Jim, Rick Santelli over at CNBC putting a little bit of cold water on this, saying once an economy has shrunk, growing by 33% is a growth in a smaller economy, but I think we're quibbling a little bit there. This is, to some extent, a V-shaped recovery. Our output is getting pretty darn close in terms of goods and services to where it was back in the spring. And so while we're not back to where we want to be, certainly employment-wise, and in some other categories, this is very welcome news.
Indeed, Greg, and you should be looking at everyone in the country should be looking at this and saying, wow, that's good news. I'm really glad to hear that. Now, because this is breaking 5 days before an election day, and we've already kind of, incorporated in our minds this concept that good economic news helps President Trump, bad economic news hurts President Trump. There are all kinds of people who then want to, I can't look at what the numbers say. I have to figure out a way to make the numbers say what I want them to say. Right? So very quickly, as we've seen pretty much since, late spring when we kind of hit bottom, people jumped out to say, yes, but we're not all the way back yet. Well, no, of course we're not all the way. It's the end of October. Now, if you've looked out the window, the pandemic is still going on. We're not going to get back to 100% until there's either a vaccine, herd immunity, which I think would be really tough to reach at the pace we're going, until people can walk around, go into a store, go into a restaurant for full capacity, get into a crowd, go to a concert, go to a sporting event, until they can go out and do all the things they used to be able to do. Yesterday's podcast, we talked about the ridiculous rules that California wanted to put on for Thanksgiving, get-togethers. Until we can live our lives normally, we're not going to have the normal economy we're used to. But if you add it all up, it comes up to the neighborhood of we're now at about 96% of where we were before the pandemic. That's really good. That's really, really close. Probably should mention, Greg, that people are like, well, how do you, boy, this is really good news for the Trump administration's exactly what they would want to see a couple days before the election. How are they going to report it? Well, here's the headline over at the Washington Post. U.S. economy grew by record 7.4% from July to September, but the data is complicated. Don't feel too good about this, America. Here's the fine print.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what we were talking about yesterday with the coverage of the riots. They weren't coverage of the riots. It was coverage of the riots. Why are you hyping this so much? And so everything runs through a filter for way too many people. Once upon a time, people would be happy to see massive economic growth like this, especially in the wake of what we saw earlier in the year. But especially in this town, people are just putting it through the political filter. So hopefully it keeps going. But Jim, in terms of good economic news, it's great news for the country. There's also good ways to keep your personal balance sheet looking good, and that's to save money wherever you can. And that's where Stamps.com comes in, especially as we get close to the holiday season and as business ramps up and people are shipping more things. Save money on postage. This holiday season, more people are going to be mailing more stuff than ever, and that means the post office could be very busy. You don't have time for that, and you don't have to go. That's the most important thing. Stamps.com brings the post office and now UPS shipping right to your computer. You can mail and ship anything right from the convenience of your home or office, because with Stamps.com, anything you could ever do at the post office, you can do with just a few clicks at home. Plus, Stamps.com saves you money with deep, deep discounts that you can't even get at the post office.
Stamps.com brings the services of the U.S. Postal Service and UPS right to your computer. Stamps.com is a must-have for any business, whether you're a small office that's sending out invoices, an online seller who's fulfilling orders during this record-setting holiday season, or even a giant warehouse sending thousands of packages a day. Stamps.com can handle it all with ease. You simply use your computer to print official U.S. postage 24/7 for any letter, any package, any class of mail, anywhere you want to send. Once your mail is ready, you just schedule a pickup or you can drop it off. It's just that simple. With Stamps.com, you get 5 cents off of every first-class stamp and up to 40% off of priority mail and up to 62% off of UPS shipping rates. Not to mention, it's a fraction of the cost of those expensive postage meters. Stamps.com is a no-brainer, saving you time and money. It's no wonder that more than 900,000 small businesses already use Stamps.com.
Oh, man, we used to have one of those expensive postage meters here at Radio America. Not only was it super expensive, but it was always having issues. You had to have people come in and fix it. Stamps.com, way, way easier. Don't spend a minute of your holiday season at the post office this year. Sign up for Stamps.com instead. There's no risk. With our promo code 3Martini, all spelled out, one word, no space, 3Martini, you get a special offer that includes a 4-week trial, plus free postage and a digital scale. No long-term commitments or contracts. Just go to Stamps.com, click on the microphone at the top of the homepage, and type in, all one word, 3Martini. That's Stamps.com, enter 3Martini. Stamps.com, never go to the post office again. All right, Jim, let's talk about the first of our 2 crazy martinis. Yesterday afternoon, everyone's going to remember 30 years from now. Where were you when you found out this news? It's kind of like finding out who Deep Throat was about a decade ago. I don't know how many folks even remember who that was now. It was Mark Felt, former deputy director of the FBI. But early yesterday afternoon, it came over Twitter, where I was watching, and probably other places as well. We are going to find out who Anonymous was, this high-ranking Trump administration official who originally wrote the op-ed and then a book under the name Anonymous. This is going to be a person who separates themselves from the president, blows the lid off of this. It's going to be a person with the kind of credibility that could possibly really shake up this presidential race with just days to go before Election Day. And so we found out, Jim, it was Miles Taylor, the Miles Taylor. And if you're saying, I have no idea who that is, that's the point. He was probably better known when he was anonymous. He was a former official at the Department of Homeland Security, eventually became chief of staff to the Secretary of Homeland Security over there. But Miles Taylor has had an issue here over the past 24 hours, Jim. Turns out he was point blank asked by Anderson Cooper at CNN, where Miles Taylor is a contributor, at least as of right now, whether or not he knew anything about Anonymous or even was anonymous. This was a number of months ago. Here's what he said.
There was an op-ed, there was a book by someone calling themselves Anonymous. Are you aware of who that is?
I'm not. Look, and that was a parlor game that happened in Washington, D.C. of a lot of folks trying to think of who that might be. I've got my own thoughts about who that might be, but I want my focus to be on the president, and I certainly don't want to. I wear a mask for 2 things, Anderson: Halloweens and pandemics. So no.
It's fun to watch that video because Anderson Cooper doesn't find that funny or interesting at all. So last night, Miles Taylor's making the rounds, and Chris Cuomo even reads him the riot act for making CNN look stupid for hiring this guy and for pumping this up for months and I guess probably more than a year now of this huge administration official who's coming clean, and it's pretty much a nobody.
What matters most, certainly to me, you lied to us, Miles. You were asked in August if you were anonymous here on CNN with Anderson Cooper, and you said no. Now, why should CNN keep you on the payroll after lying like that?
Chris, it's a great question, and I'll just give you the blunt truth. When I published a warning, I said in the book that if asked, I would strenuously deny I was the author. And here's the reason. Because the things I said in that book were ideas that I wanted Donald Trump to challenge on their merits. We have seen over the course of 4 years that Donald Trump's preference is to find personal attacks and distractions to pull people away from criticisms of his record. I wrote that work anonymously to deprive him of that opportunity and to force him to answer the questions on their merits.
By lying, I'm showing that I'm a truly honorable person who wants to have these issues addressed. So, Jim, fun to watch everyone react to this. The left is furious because they got played. The media looks terrible for publishing this guy and pumping up his resume when it wasn't warranted. And, of course, the conservatives are still trying to regain their composure from laughing so hard. What's your take?
You know, Greg, one of the first things that comes out of me is basically his message is, look, I lied so quick because we need to restore honesty and integrity to government. This really stuck in my craw, and I wrote a lot about this in the Morning Jolt. And, you know, there are a lot of times we complain about the media a lot. We generally don't. This feels Dan Rather-esque. This feels like a giant hoax was perpetuated upon the American public, because if they had run this and we had known that this was at first a policy advisor and then a deputy chief of staff to the Secretary of Homeland Security, and then eventually, after the op-ed ran, he became the chief of staff to the Secretary of Homeland Security, we probably wouldn't have found it to be that big a deal. I mean, like, it'd be a page A6 story. It's not. You'd rather not have the deputy chief of staff of Homeland Security saying, I think the president is a doofus and we're trying to work against him. This basically, it was kind of intriguing to see just how widespread the negative reaction was yesterday. But I really think this is going to be meaningless unless people take lessons from it. The first, for the Miles Tellers of the world, is
Taylor.
Taylor, who? I don't know. Was it Taylor Swift? Whatever.
You said Miles Teller.
The actor? Okay, yeah. Well, look, Miles Taylor feels like, first of all, his name sounds like an alias, right? If you don't want to be, that's would you sign into the hotel registry if you don't want people knowing you're staying there? Miles Taylor, there's nothing I can say to him that's going to change anything, but to anybody else who's out there, if you work for the federal government, if you work for an administration, and you belatedly realize, wow, this president is a doofus, I don't like this guy. I think not only do I think he's a doofus, first of all, half the people in government think their bosses are doofuses. Read the Weed Agency, people. This is really not all that, shocking. This is, I'm sure Greg could tell you stories. I can tell you stories about bosses I've had that have been schmucks. This is just part of the nature of the working world. So the first thing is, don't be surprised if you go to work for a place and you're deeply disappointed by the person in charge. Then the next step is, if you're upset with it, one, don't expect the New York Times to find it to be a huge deal that you're upset with it. Or at least traditionally, newspaper, the deputy chief of staff being really frustrated with the president is not really earth-shattering news. So, and you can, once you're in that situation, if you genuinely think not just your boss is a doofus or the president's a doofus, but that he's harming the country, he's doing genuinely bad things, well, then you have a choice. You can either suck it up and keep working there because you want the paycheck, or you think it's going to get better someday, or you think you can mitigate the damage. All right, okay. Or you can say, you know what, I don't want to work for this guy. This is in opposition to my moral principles. I feel like I'm selling my soul by being here. I'm out of here. And we've seen people in the Trump administration do that. We've seen this in a bunch of administrations. I think there were one or two folks who left the Clinton administration after he signed welfare reform. They were convinced this was a terrible moral mistake on their part. And you always have that right. You got to go out and find another job. That can be a pain in the neck, depending on the state of the economy and how applicable your skills are. But no one's forcing you to stay there. No one forced Taylor, not Teller, right? No one forced him to get into that job. I assume he applied for it. I assume he interviewed for it. At any one of those points, he could have said, you know what? I don't know if I believe what this president believes. I should leave. Look, I got a lot of gripes with this president, but every president deserves a staff that is actually on their team. When the president says, I want the policy to be X, he deserves a cabinet, he deserves secretaries, undersecretary, everybody on board should be, either you're on board with the idea or there's the door. Those are your options. There is no, I'm secretly going to sabotage it behind the scenes. You are not some sort of daring allied saboteur behind the lines in Nazi Germany during World War II. For a whole bunch of reasons, but one of them is, Greg, they didn't write, newspaper op-eds saying, I am working behind the lines in Nazi Germany right now. If you're secretly trying to do something, don't write op-eds talking about how terrific you are. By the way, also that op-ed, I think we can now look at it and say a lot of it's nonsense. I mean, he referred to cabinet secretaries having discussions about the 25th Amendment. Do you really think they're saying, hey, look, I think the president's nuts. I think we got to go call in McMaster, call in Mattis, and hey, you know what? Get Teller, the deputy chief of staff at DHS. He's the kind of guy who we need in on this kind of discussion. You know, he talked about Russia policy. I don't know if he'd be in a position to do anything with Russia policy. How would he even know about that stuff? So the whole tone of it, and by the way, I should mention this on this podcast, Greg, as you'll remember, and I assume probably a lot of listeners remember, I was convinced from early on this was John Huntsman, who was the U.S. ambassador to Russia. And I kept thinking, they are on the hunts for the man who wrote this op-ed and things like that. I was wrong. It was not John Huntsman. John Huntsman always seemed like a really incongruous guy to be in this administration. But you know what? I feel bad, John Huntsman, if you're listening. If you're listening, I'm impressed. I don't really think you've bothered to listen to this podcast. But if you did, I'm sorry. I should not have so confidently accused you of that. From everything we've seen, you served loyally and ably and professionally in this administration. I should not have accused you of being this weasel. But as for a lot of this is also on the New York Times, which they knew who this guy was. He was just some schmo. He was just some guy. It wasn't really big news that he thought. And they arranged it, and they described him as a senior administration official. By the way, he was, I think, 30 when he wrote this op-ed, Greg. They really left the impression that maybe this is Mattis. Maybe this is there were some people at Huffington Post who speculated it was Pence because of the use of the word lodestar. You know, when you say a senior administration official, the impression left was that this was somebody, at least a cabinet secretary, maybe the head of an agency, somebody higher than deputy chief of staff at one particular department. It feels like it was all just a big prank. I feel like they were laughing at us the whole time, and everybody thought it was somebody significant. And in the end, it was Miles Taylor, right? Not Teller? Yes. Not the actor?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, as I mentioned on Twitter yesterday, this is the second time someone named Miles has undermined an administration, although Miles Papazian in season 5 of 24 actually helped the president that time. He erased the recording linking President Logan to the assassination of former President Palmer. That was not a very smart move for his career advancement. But, Jim, you mentioned the New York Times puffing up the significance of the author of this anonymous column, which ultimately led to a book deal. We get a lot of stories based on sources close to the president or sources in a position to know, whether it was on the Russia reporting or the recent Atlantic story with unnamed sources about what the president had to say about military people. I mean, once something like this comes out, how much credibility do they have on other stories where they won't name their source?
Yeah, I think it was Chris Cillizza over at CNN early on in this who said, look, this is not going to be just some schmo. The New York Times is too big, too respected, too serious a paper to use the term senior administration official to describe somebody who nobody's ever heard of. Chris Cillizza has a lot of egg on his face. And I don't want to spend a lot of time kicking him around because I think he's walking around with a perception of the New York Times that was accurate, probably 10 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. Certainly, I don't know if 30 years ago the New York Times would have gone along with this. I'd like to think that a generation ago, the New York Times would have said to this kid, look, kid, go talk to our reporters, and they'll decide if your problems with the president represent a genuine news story. We're not putting you on the op-ed page and describing you as a senior administration official. You're just not that big a deal. And something changed in the culture of the New York Times. The New York Times then decided, well, look, nobody knows who this, Miles Taylor is. I keep wanting to say Miles Teller. Was it Ricochet, the film he was in? Anyway, nobody's going to know who this kid is. But if we describe this person as a senior administration official, people are going to think this is somebody really big. People are going to think that somebody in Trump's cabinet is working against him. We're going to create this giant guessing game in Washington, and we're going to create this giant controversy and this even more paranoia within the administration about who's leaking. And in the end, it's this kid. People walk around with the perception of the New York Times, and I think arguably maybe the Washington Post, CNN, institutions like NBC News, with this idea of based on who they were, not on who they are today. And it's deeply frustrating. For all of our problems with the media of the 80s and 90s and maybe into the early 2000s, they're better than these guys. They took their jobs more seriously, and they wouldn't have played along with something like this. And I really feel this feels like a Dan Rather-esque moment for the national news media.
It's been quite a year for the New York Times. You know, they had a huge uprising over Tom Cotton. Only certain opinions now are allowed on the opinion page, and this guy got pumped up exponentially beyond what was justified in this situation. So everybody...
I'm sure somewhere in the offices right now, Greg, they're saying, hey, everybody's talking about us.
Hi, I'm Sarah Carter, host of the Sarah Carter Podcast. Everywhere you look these days, we're seeing an aggressive effort to destroy what made America great, tearing down our history, attacking our freedoms, and canceling any person who dares to cross the progressive speech police. We cannot stand by and let this happen. It's time for the silent majority to become the unsilent majority. Join me on the Sarah Carter Podcast. Subscribe at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
All right, well, let's talk about our second crazy martini now, Jim. And it has been said on this podcast and elsewhere, it looks like the presidential race is going to be pretty tight, particularly in the swing states. Some of the national polls still show a pretty big lead for Biden, but Trump is now ahead, at least in one poll in Florida, maybe more than that. And things are tightening. He might have even popped ahead in a couple other Midwestern states, especially in the Trafalgar polls. Those are generally more favorable to him, but they did get the Electoral College count right 4 years ago, so that's a feather in their cap. We'll see how they do this year. Their most recent poll is of the state of Minnesota, which the Republicans have not won since 1972 with the Nixon landslide over George McGovern. That's the only state Reagan lost in 1984, mainly because Mondale was from Minnesota and he barely won it. But looking at some earlier polls, they've got Biden up 6 in Minnesota in a Star Tribune poll. The center-left Minnesota Post survey has Biden up 5. Trafalgar's got it at 3.2 with leaners. Without leaners, it's 45.9 for Biden, 43.7 for Trump. And with the leaners, it's 48 even for Biden, 44.8 for Trump. And you're thinking, okay, well, what's crazy about this? What's crazy about this is who's in third place. We don't have the highly prominent third-party candidates this time like Jill Stein or Gary Johnson. Jo Jorgensen, the woman who is the nominee for the Libertarian Party, is in fourth place at 2%. And in third place at 3.3%, well ahead of Jorgensen, Jim, Kanye West. You know, he had all these disappointments of not getting on the ballot in various states. I'm not sure if he's actually on in Minnesota or not, but he's in third place. So if you're the Libertarian Party, you got to be feeling a little bit down today.
Yeah. I mean, I was doing a comparison of Trump's performance in 2016 to the Senate races that year and how the Republican in that. And one of the things that jumps out is how many states where the minor party candidates, Gary Johnson of the Libertarian Party, Jill Stein of the Greens, and in some places, Evan McMullen, running as an independent, they really just got a much bigger chunk. Now, obviously, as a total of the vote, it wasn't very high, but by historical standards, that was a lot. And in a lot of cases, if Trump's got 47, that's not usually enough. But if Hillary's got 45 and the rest are spread amongst these other candidates, Trump wins. He gets all the electoral votes. It really was a surprisingly key factor in 2016. And so far, it looks like that's not it. Jo Jorgensen is just not as well known as Gary Johnson. He's not doing these wacky interviews on MSNBC with his tongue, But Jo Jorgensen is a she, by the way. Pardon me. Good luck, Greg. You're an extremely bright guy. Can you name the Green Party nominee this year?
Not a clue.
Howie Hawkins.
Okay.
And that is not an alias like Miles Taylor. And I don't really think there's no equivalent of an Evan McMullen that I've seen, anybody who's running independent. And probably the closest one would be Kanye. Now, when this came out, you're like, oh my God, you thought Trump was a celebrity candidate. This, as you mentioned, he's not made the ballot in a lot of places. I'd be interested to see in these places where some people who are really not, tuned into politics, but let's say they're big Kanye West fans. They loved that island getaway his wife had the other day, and they go to the polls and Kanye West is not on the ballot. Do they? I wonder. I really wonder what they do. I don't know if they're going to break one way or the other, or leave it blank, or maybe in some places they'll write him in. As for Trump's chances of winning Minnesota, he came within about 2 points last time, and that was so obviously that's the one where you're like, okay, this is our best chance to flip a blue state. This is highly targeted. And certainly they put in resources, and then the riots and all that stuff. The polling has never looked that great for Trump. I guess around late August, actually, they went from a 8 to 9 point margin to about a 6 point margin, maybe 5. And so it's okay. It's closer. And now, in the aggregate, it's closer to 9. So that Survey USA poll putting it within 5. Okay, now you're almost within striking distance, but I don't think it's going to go there. But then again, if you have this, if all of a sudden there's this a whole bunch of people who show up expecting to vote for Kanye, and they go in some other direction, maybe something in the 40-some% range might be enough to win this state. We'll see.
They're talking about where the congressional districts where Trump might do well, including Minnesota 7, which is actually represented by a Democrat named Colin Peterson, who was one of the 2 that did not vote for impeachment in the House. Kanye's got 6% of the vote in that district. So, Jim, it's a kind of a more conservative district. So could Kanye actually be hurting Trump in a state that could be relatively close?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is that, remember the Oval Office meeting, Kanye wearing the Make America Great hat, that Kanye West was a very surprising celebrity supporter of Trump. And if you're Trump, you'd rather have him out there, doing events with you and encouraging people to vote. By the way, this is a whole separate conversation, but 2 of my colleagues, Kevin Williamson and David French, paid attention to Kanye. Remember, about a year ago, Kanye West announced he was redoing his entire career around gospel.
Yes.
And he did these series of concerts called Sunday Services.
Right.
I did not attend or pay attention to them, but my colleagues did, and they said that there was some genuine attempt at spiritual growth going on in Kanye West. They were impressed. Your mileage may vary, but I just kind of think that Kanye West looks, a lot of the times he seems like he's nuts. On the other times, he doesn't seem like maybe there's some. Or it seems like there's something a little more profound cooking up in that mind of his. So, he the idea in some ways, jumping in and meeting with Trump in the Oval Office seems like this perfect publicity stunt. But maybe he really does want to improve the country. Maybe he really does want to do something. I don't know if trying to be a celebrity pop star and this half-hearted running for president effort is really the right way to go about it. But good luck, Kanye. You've got a lot on your plate.
Jim, if Trump is reelected, I don't know if Rick Perry is ready for something else or maybe a new office within the Department of Energy. He could be the Secretary of Dragon Energy. I think that would be it.
I was trying to think about Kanye West, Western states. There's something in there. But, actually, we shouldn't say, because if you want to look at, who had more influence on criminal justice reform over the past 3 years, there's a serious argument to be made that it's Kim Kardashian West.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. They have had a voice that was heard in this administration, and there are people whose lives are vastly and radically changed because they're out of prison and trying to prove that giving them a second chance was the right decision. So from Alice Johnson on to another one that just happened in the last few days here. So they actually have done some good work. Doesn't mean you necessarily want them speaking at your convention, but they have had a positive impact, at least in the lives of quite a few people here. Amazing.
Even the dumbest people in the world can probably teach us something. This is not saying that necessarily they're the dumbest people in the world, but just recognizing, everybody's got value in one form or another.
All right, Jim. Tomorrow's Friday, our last Friday before Election Day. See you then.
See you tomorrow, Greg.
Jim Garrity, National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thank you very much for being with us today. Don't forget our wonderful friends over at Stamps.com. Just go to Stamps.com, click on the microphone at the top of the homepage, and type in 3 Martini to get those special deals that we mentioned before. Also, please subscribe to the 3 Martini Lunch podcast. Leave us a kind review and a 5-star rating. We're always extremely thankful for those. And remember, you can get us on those home devices. You just have to say, play 3 Martini Lunch podcast. Have a great day, and we'll see you Friday on the 3 Martini Lunch.
Hi, it's Dana Lash, host of The Dana Show. Every day, I'm here to keep you up to speed on the most important stories and info that you need to know in your very busy life. And if you're always on the go and you want to stay connected, just download our daily podcast and take it with you. It's a great way to get up to speed on what you need to know and what legacy media may not be telling you. Visit danaradio.com and click on the podcast link or subscribe at iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts.